I was crying by my wife Emily's casket when my own son stormed in, screaming like a madman. He shoved me with all his strength in front of 250 people. He hit me in the back and I fell to the floor. That same day I discovered Daniel had been planning to rob me for years, and when I got up off that floor, I knew I would never be the same. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell, because we publish new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. April 23rd, 2019 was the darkest day of my life, even though I didn't know it at the time. Emily, my partner of 38 years, had passed away 3 days earlier from a massive heart attack. There was no time for goodbyes, no chance to tell her I loved her one last time. The viewing was being held at St. Michael's Funeral Home in New York, a place I had visited too many times in my youth to say goodbye to friends and family, but I never thought I would come here to say goodbye to my own wife. I was standing by the casket, my hands shaking, unable to let go of the cold wood that held the woman who had been my everything. I didn't notice the people passing by, offering their condolences. Their words sounded like a distant hum, like someone talking through water. My eyes were fixed on Emily's serene face, trying to memorize it forever, knowing I would never see her again in this life. That's when I heard the voice, a furious voice, unknown to me because I had never heard it in that tone, the voice of my son Daniel. He burst through the main door of the funeral home like a wild animal, his fists clenched, his face red with rage. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't approach his mother's casket with respect. He just advanced toward me, screaming words that would leave deep scars on my soul. "Get out of here, you useless old man," he yelled as he moved forward. "I don't want to see you here. You killed my mother with your negligence. If you had taken care of her, if you had noticed something was wrong, she would still be alive." I didn't have time to process his words. Daniel raised his hands and pushed me with all the force he could gather. I felt the floor disappear from under my feet. My body flew backward, crashing against Emily's casket. The flowers scattered through the air. I hit the floor with a hard thud that echoed throughout the chapel. Pain shot through my back like 1,000 needles. 250 people witnessed everything. Some screamed, others fell silent, frozen by the shock. Cell phone cameras started recording. A local newspaper photographer covering the event captured the exact moment I fell to the ground. Daniel kept screaming insults while I lay on the floor, unable to move, feeling the burn of humiliation, along with the physical pain. My son, the man I had raised from birth, the man whose education, trips, and first steps in life I had paid for, was humiliating me at the worst moment of my existence. That's when I saw Michael, Daniel's father-in-law, moving through the crowd. Michael was a 6'5" man, with a heart bigger than most people I had known. Without hesitating, he extended his hand and helped me up from the floor. I felt his firm hand supporting me, as shame burned my face. "It's okay, William," Michael whispered as he helped me stand. "I'm right here with you." Daniel kept screaming, but the funeral home security finally intervened and dragged him out of the place. As they took him outside, he kept insulting me, kept blaming me for his mother's death. And in that moment, lying on the floor, being helped by my daughter-in-law's father, I understood something that would change the rest of my life. I understood that my son was not who I thought he was. The days after the viewing were a blur of pain and confusion. I spent the first 48 hours without sleep, lying in the bed I had shared with Emily for nearly 4 decades. Breathing in the scent that still lingered on her pillows. My body ached. The bruises on my back turned a dark purple that seemed to spread like ink in water. Every movement caused sharp pains that reminded me of the brutality of what had happened. On the 4th day, as I was trying to make coffee in the kitchen, I received a call from Michael. His voice sounded different, firmer, more determined than usual. "William, you need to come to the precinct. There are videos. A lot of people recorded what happened at the viewing. The police have already formally identified your son." I felt something wake up inside me. It wasn't revenge, at least not yet. It was something more primitive. The need for someone to acknowledge that what happened wasn't a coincidence, that it wasn't a justifiable emotional outburst. It was pure violence. That afternoon I went to the local police precinct. Detective Miller was a 5'2" man with the face of someone who had seen too much human suffering. He had gray eyes that seemed to examine every word I spoke, searching for truths I hadn't even discovered myself. "Mr. Evans, we've collected 16 different videos of the incident," the detective explained, showing me a folder with documents. "Several witnesses have already submitted sworn statements. Your son was identified without a doubt by multiple sources." The detective showed me the photographs of my bruises, 3 images of my back showing the impact marks. Then he handed me a tablet where I could watch the videos captured by the attendees' cell phones. I saw my own fall from different angles, as if it were a cinematic event documented by an invisible audience. I saw my body hitting the floor. I saw Michael running toward me. I saw Daniel's face filled with fury before security took him away. "These videos constitute solid evidence of assault," the detective continued. "We have enough to open a formal investigation. However, I will need you to file an official complaint. Do you wish to proceed?" I took a deep breath. Emily had just been buried 3 days ago. My life was destroyed, and now I had to make a decision that would change everything. "Yes," I replied, with a clarity I didn't know I possessed. "I want to file the complaint." The detective began to draft the document. As he wrote, he asked me about every detail of what happened. He asked me to describe exactly what Daniel had said, how the attack occurred, if there had been any prior provocation on my part. I answered every question precisely, although some memories hurt more than others. What surprised me was the amount of evidence they already had. Besides the videos, they had the testimony of 16 eyewitnesses. One of those people was Emily Rogers, the funeral home director, who had carefully documented the names of all attendees. Another was Frank Thompson, a lawyer who happened to be at the viewing because his mother had been friends with Emily. "Mr. Thompson has voluntarily offered to be an expert witness in court," the detective mentioned. "He says he's never seen anything so brutal at a funeral." As the hours passed at the precinct, I began to realize something. The facts were documented almost perfectly. The videos showed the truth without ambiguity. The witnesses were credible. The physical evidence of my injuries was undeniable. Daniel would have no easy way to defend himself. But as the detective drafted the final details of the formal complaint, a question began to bother me. Why had Daniel acted so out of control? What had motivated him to risk himself like that in front of so many people? It wasn't typical of him. Daniel was impulsive, yes, but he wasn't stupid. This violence seemed excessive, as if something deep had been boiling beneath the surface for a long time. The detective closed the folder and looked at me with that expression only someone accustomed to crime possesses. "We will send officers to locate your son so he can turn himself in voluntarily. If he doesn't do so in the next 72 hours, we will issue an arrest warrant. Either way, this is going to court." I left the precinct as the sun was setting over the city. Michael was waiting for me at the door, with 2 coffees in his hands. As we walked, I started talking about my suspicions. Michael listened attentively, nodding occasionally. "Something doesn't add up, Michael," I said. "Daniel wouldn't act like this without a reason. His behavior was too violent, too public, as if he wanted it to happen." Michael took a sip of his coffee and looked at me intently. "Then let's find out what motivated him. Because believe me, if there's something hidden, we will find it." At that moment, as the lights of New York City turned on around us, I didn't know that the following weeks would reveal secrets I never imagined existed in my own son's life. 2 weeks had passed since I filed the formal complaint. During that time, life forced me to continue with routines that no longer made sense. I had to sort through Emily's belongings, decide what to keep and what to donate. I had to notify her friends about the final arrangements. I had to pretend I was still functioning as a human being, when, in reality, I was falling apart from the inside. It was on the afternoon of May 19th, when I discovered the first piece of evidence that would change my perception of everything. I was reorganizing papers on the bedroom desk, looking for documents about Emily's insurance policy, when I found a dark blue folder I didn't recognize. Inside were letters, bank statements, and a series of printed emails. My heart began to race as I read the headers. The documents belonged to Daniel. There was correspondence from a private bank addressed to my son. The statements showed frequent transactions, occasional deposits, and more worryingly, constantly increasing withdrawals. But what really caught my attention was a letter from a credit institution dated February of that same year. The first line was clear. Outstanding debt of $42,000. $42,000. My hands trembled as I read each line. There were several collection letters, some marked urgent in red letters. There were contact attempts from lawyers specializing in debt recovery. There were threats of legal seizures. But that wasn't all. I also found a printed email between Daniel and someone named Mark Foster. The content of the message was disturbing. Daniel, we've spoken with the bank. If you don't pay the $42,000 by June 30th, we will proceed with a formal lawsuit. We understand your father is a person of means. Perhaps it's time to have an honest conversation with him about your financial situation. Below that email, there was a reply from Daniel dated 3 days later. Mark, my father is cheap and won't give me anything. But there are other ways to solve this. I'm working on a plan. Give me more time. I felt the air escape from my lungs. What plan? What was Daniel referring to? I searched frantically through the folder, finding more documents. There were notes for personal loans from Daniel's friends, money borrowed from work colleagues, money that was supposedly for investments or business projects that never materialized. Each loan was larger than the last, as if Daniel was digging a deeper and deeper hole. One letter especially caught my eye. It was from someone named Sarah Morgan, a childhood friend of Daniel's. Daniel, we have waited 2 years for the money you borrowed. $30,000 is not a small amount. Your father is a wealthy man. Please, do something. My family is suffering because we trusted you. If you don't return the money by August, I will have to take legal action. An additional $30,000. The amounts multiplied in my mind like a mathematical nightmare I couldn't fully process. I grabbed my cell phone and called Michael immediately. Michael, I need you to come to the house. Now. I found something. 30 minutes later, Michael was in my living room, reviewing all the documents with me. His expression darkened with every page he read. My God, William, he whispered, Daniel is completely drowning in debt. It seems he's been borrowing money from anyone who will listen, I replied. Friends, colleagues, banks, and none of it has stopped him. Michael began to take meticulous notes. He suggested I contact everyone mentioned in the documents to verify the information. We spent the next few hours making phone calls. Most people responded with frustration, describing years of waiting without repayment, broken promises, and deliberate avoidance by Daniel. A man named John Reynolds, who had loaned Daniel $15,000, explained something that was enlightening. Mr. Evans, your son told me on several occasions that his father was very rich, but also very selfish. He told me he was waiting for you to have an accident or pass away so he could inherit. That was almost 3 years ago. When I asked him to pay me back, he would just say to be patient, that soon everything would change in his favor. John's words hit me like a physical punch. Daniel had been talking about my potential death. He had been counting on my disappearance as part of his financial strategy. That night, after Michael left, I reviewed all the documents again. This time I started looking for patterns. I began to note specific dates. The borrowing had intensified in the last 16 months. The debts were accumulating faster as time went on. It was like watching someone jump off a cliff, hoping someone would catch them before they hit the bottom. What if that someone supposed to catch him was me? What if the assault at the viewing hadn't been just an emotional outburst, but part of something bigger? I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until 3 a.m., reading and rereading every letter, every document, every line of text. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that was simultaneously logical and terrifying. My son wasn't just financially broke. My son was desperate, and a desperate man is capable of unpredictable things. 3 weeks after discovering the financial documents, I received news from Detective Miller. Daniel had voluntarily turned himself in at the precinct with his own lawyer, a man named Stephen Cole, who specialized in criminal defense. The process was moving slowly through the justice system, but the charges were solid. The court had scheduled a preliminary hearing for June 16th. However, something in me knew that the legal system would only give me partial satisfaction. A court could convict Daniel for the assault, but who would give me answers about his true intentions? Who would explain why his behavior had been so deliberately brutal? It was Michael who suggested the meeting. "William, you need to talk to him directly," he told me one morning while we were having coffee at a cafe near my home. "Not at a precinct, not surrounded by police. You need to know what's really going on in his head." "Do you think he'll agree to meet with me?" I asked skeptically. "I think so, especially if you give him the impression that you're considering the possibility of reconciliation. Men like Daniel, desperate men, always see an opportunity in the other person's forgiveness." The idea was bold, possibly dangerous. But Michael was right. There was something I needed to find out, something I couldn't get from documents or testimonies. I needed to hear directly from Daniel what his true purpose was, his true vision of the future he had been planning. I spent 2 days composing the message. It needed to sound genuine. It needed to seem like I had been reflecting deeply on what happened at the viewing and had concluded that perhaps I had been unfair to my son. I wrote several versions before deciding on the final wording. The message was sent through Daniel's lawyer. "Daniel, I've had time to reflect on the recent events. I've been suffering, and maybe I haven't been fair to you. Your mother just passed away, and we are both going through incomparable pain. I would like to have a private conversation with you, without lawyers, without witnesses, just father and son. If you are willing, I propose we meet at the City Line Diner next Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. I hope you understand that this is a gesture of good faith on my part. Your father, William." The reply came 24 hours later. Daniel accepted the meeting. On Tuesday, June 25th, 2 hours before the appointment, I visited an electronics store. I bought a small digital audio recorder, the kind of device that could be easily hidden in a jacket pocket. I consulted with a lawyer friend of mine about the legality of recording a private conversation in New York. He informed me that in New York, if at least one party in the conversation is aware of the recording, it is completely legal. I was that aware party. At 2:45 p.m., I sat at a secluded table in the City Line Diner with the recorder turned on inside my jacket. My heart was pounding with an intensity I hadn't felt in years. My hands were sweaty, but my mind was crystal clear, focused on a single objective: get the truth. Daniel arrived at 3 o'clock sharp. He looked different, thinner, more worn out. His eyes had that look of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. He sat across from me, without making eye contact initially. "Thanks for coming." I began with a carefully cultivated softness. "I know all of this has been complicated. Your mother's death has affected us both in ways we might not fully understand." Daniel took a deep breath. When he finally looked me in the eyes, I saw something I didn't expect. Remorse. Or at least, a convincing simulation of remorse. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what happened to me that day. It was like something broke inside me. Mom's death, the stress. I just exploded." "I understand," I replied, allowing my voice to sound sympathetic. "But I need to know, Daniel, is there something else? Something you've been holding back? Because I feel like your reaction was more intense than just grief over your mother's death." Daniel looked out the window for a long moment. I saw his jaw tighten. When he spoke again, there was a change in his tone. Less apologetic, more honest, perhaps too honest. "Dad, I'm in trouble," he finally admitted. "Debts. A lot of debt. I've been looking for ways to solve it, but nothing is working." "How much debt?" I asked, with a calm I didn't feel. "Over $40,000, he replied. "Maybe more. I've lost count." I let him continue talking, and as Daniel broke down his financial situation in front of me, the recorder in my pocket captured every word, every confession, every justification. What disturbed me most wasn't the amount of debt. It was what Daniel revealed about his vision of the future. "Dad, you have resources. You've always had resources, and I I've been waiting. I've been waiting for something to change in my favor. Because I understand that when a father dies, his children inherit. It's the natural way of things. The words fell between us like stones in a pond. Were you waiting for my death? I asked, although I already knew the answer. It's not exactly like that, Daniel replied, but his evasion was more revealing than any direct confession. I know that eventually, things will change for me. That was the moment I understood that everything I had suspected was true. My son hadn't attacked me at the viewing out of uncontrolled emotional pain. He had attacked me because he was going crazy with financial anxiety, because he saw his situation as desperate, because he knew he would have to wait years, possibly decades, to access any inheritance. We finished our coffee 30 minutes later. Daniel seemed relieved to have confessed something, even if only partially. He believed we had started a process of reconciliation. He didn't know that his every word had been recorded, documented, preserved as evidence of his true motivations. When I left the diner, the recorder was still in my pocket, and on that device was the proof that Daniel's attack had not been an act of blind passion, but the symptom of a deeper disease: greed. That night, after returning home from the City Line diner, I stayed awake listening to the recording a dozen times. Each playback revealed new nuances in Daniel's words, new layers of meaning I had previously overlooked. My son's voice sounded different when he talked about money, about inheritance, about the future. It sounded hungry. Michael came to my house on Thursday morning. The first thing he did was listen to the entire recording without interruption. When it finished, he was silent for almost 5 minutes. Then he removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. "William, this is more serious than we imagined," he finally murmured. "Your son isn't just in debt. Your son is fixated on your future. He's living in a fantasy where you disappear, and everything magically resolves itself. Do you think he was planning something more than just pressuring me for money?" I asked, although the answer was already forming in my mind. "I don't know," Michael replied, "but this recording is evidence of his true motives." A lawyer could argue that the attack was precipitated by financial desperation. But this, he pointed to the audio player, this suggests emotional premeditation, intent. I called Stephen Cole, the lawyer a trusted colleague had recommended. Stephen was a 60-year-old man with an impeccable reputation in family and criminal matters. I knew him by sight, although we had never worked together before. When I described the situation and mentioned the recording, he asked to come to my house immediately. Stephen listened to the recording 3 times before giving his professional opinion. "This is gold, William," he said, with a calmness that contrasted sharply with my inner agitation. "Your son has admitted to being under extreme financial stress. He has revealed he was waiting for something to happen in his favor, specifically in terms of inheritance. He even acknowledged that his reaction at the viewing was disproportionate. All of this, combined with the video evidence from eyewitnesses, creates a very compelling picture." "What do you recommend I do?" I asked. "There are several options," Stephen explained, leaning back on my sofa. "You could use this recording simply as support for the criminal case, allowing the court to convict Daniel for the assault. Or you could go further. You could initiate additional legal actions to protect your estate. You could review your will, make changes to your final provisions. Establish safeguards that protect your assets from someone who clearly has questionable intentions." Stephen's words hung in the air like seeds that needed to germinate in my mind. Protect my estate. Change my will. It was something I had avoided consciously considering until that moment, because doing so meant admitting that my relationship with Daniel was beyond repair. "Do you think Daniel would try something more extreme?" I asked Stephen, the question that had really been tormenting me since the recording. Stephen narrowed his eyes as he considered the question. "It's hard to say," he replied carefully. "Men under extreme financial stress can do unpredictable things. Some commit suicide. Others commit crimes. Some disappear. What I can say is that someone who has admitted to waiting for your death as a solution to his problems is someone who has thought about your death. That is a troubling fact." After Stephen left, I spent the rest of the day in a state of deep introspection. I walked through my house, touching objects Emily and I had accumulated over nearly 4 decades. I looked at photographs of Daniel as a child, pictures of his first day of school, his 10th birthday, his high school graduation. In each of those images, there was a child who looked completely different from the man who was destroying his life with debt and resentment. At what point did that innocence transform into this all-consuming greed? I remembered specific moments. The time when Daniel was 8, and I taught him to play chess. We spent hours at that board, and he showed a remarkable ability to think strategically. I remembered when he turned 16 and I bought him his first car, a used but functional sedan. His joy at that moment had been genuine, uncomplicated. At what point had life corrupted him? Or had that corruption always been there, dormant beneath the surface? That night I drafted an email to Daniel. It wasn't threatening. It was more reflective, contemplative. I wrote that I had been thinking a lot about our conversation at the diner, that I understood he was under financial pressure, but that I had decided it was best for both of us to keep some distance for a while. I wrote that I was still his father, but that I needed to protect myself. I wrote that his inheritance would still be respected when the time came, but that I had decided to make some changes to my final arrangements to ensure my resources were used responsibly. I sent the email from an account Daniel couldn't easily trace. The reply came 2 hours later. "Dad, I understand your position, but I want you to know that I am sincerely sorry for what happened at the viewing. I have been seeking professional help. Perhaps we could talk again when we've both had more time to process everything." The words were diplomatic, conciliatory even, but now I knew what lay beneath that diplomacy. I knew that beneath those carefully chosen words, Daniel was calculating his next moves, thinking about how to regain my trust, planning how to manipulate the situation to his advantage again. And in that instant, I had a revelation that would completely change my approach. I wasn't going to wait defensively to see what Daniel would do. I was going to act. I was going to move the chess pieces first. I called Stephen again. "I want you to initiate the proceedings," I told him. "All of them. Changes to the will, asset protection, everything legally possible to ensure that nothing can be touched without my explicit approval." "Are you sure?" Stephen asked. "This will be interpreted by Daniel as a definitive rejection." "Exactly," I replied. "It's time for Daniel to understand that there are real consequences for his actions. It's time for him to learn that not all plans turn out as one expects." Stephen Cole's office was located in downtown New York, in a historic building that smelled of old books and polished wood. It was a place that radiated legal authority, where words had weight and decisions were permanent. I arrived on June 30th at 9 a.m. with a folder containing all the relevant documents: the digitized recording, Daniel's bank statements, the collection letters, the creditors' testimonies. Stephen received me in his private office, a large room with windows overlooking the street. Multiple files were on his desk, a symbol of his extensive clientele and established practice. He poured himself a coffee before starting our conversation, a gesture I appreciated because it showed our meeting would be deliberate, thoughtful, not rushed. "I've reviewed your situation exhaustively," Stephen began, organizing several documents in front of him. "Your estate is considerable, William. You have properties valued at approximately $850,000, investments around $300,000, savings in various bank accounts totaling another $200,000. In total, your personal fortune amounts to approximately $1.3 million. Hearing the exact figure of my wealth stated that way was unsettling. I had never thought of my assets in those terms. I had acquired most of it through decades of disciplined work, some smart investments, and my parents' inheritance 15 years ago. But seeing it expressed like that, as a number, made everything suddenly seem vulnerable. "And what is the best strategy to protect it?" I asked. Stephen leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, a gesture he probably made hundreds of times daily in similar situations. "There are several options," he explained. "The first is to modify your will. You could redirect the majority of your estate to charitable institutions, educational foundations, or establish a trust that limits what Daniel can receive. Specifically, you could stipulate that any inheritance he receives will be distributed over several years, with conditions of responsible financial and legal behavior. Is that revenge? I asked, letting the question hang unanswered. It's not revenge, William. It's protection. It's the right you have as the owner of your estate to decide how it will be distributed after your death. Wills are modified constantly. People change their minds about their heirs all the time, especially when they discover those heirs have questionable intentions. Stephen continued detailing other strategies. He told me about revocable trusts, about transferring properties into a foundation's name, about setting up accounts that required dual authorization for any transaction. Each option was more complex than the last. Each offered an additional layer of protection against possible future actions by Daniel. But there's something else to consider, Stephen added, his tone becoming more serious. Your relationship with Daniel will likely never recover after these measures. When he learns of the changes to your will, when he receives formal notification of the limitation of his inheritance rights, he will understand that you have made a definitive decision. There will be no ambiguity. There will be no hope of future reconciliation. The words hit my chest with a force I didn't expect. More than 3 decades had passed since Daniel was born. I had been in the delivery room when he came into the world. I had held that tiny body in my arms. I had promised Emily that I would protect him and guide him throughout his life. And now I was about to cut him off completely from my inheritance? I stood up from the chair and walked to the window. The city spread out below me. Thousands of people living lives I didn't know, facing dilemmas that were perhaps similar to mine. Somewhere down there, Daniel was living his own life, perhaps thinking about our conversation at the diner, perhaps imagining a future where he would eventually inherit my fortune. I need to share something with you, Stephen, I said without turning around. 3 days ago, I found a photo album from when Daniel was a child. Photos of his first day of school, his 10th birthday, his high school graduation. In every one of those pictures, there's a child who seems completely different from the man who is destroying his life with debt and resentment. At what point did he change? When did he decide to become someone who waits for his father's death as a solution to his problems? I don't know, William, Stephen replied with genuine softness. But what I do know is that the adult Daniel made choices. Every loan he accepted, every debt he accumulated, every moment he chose not to talk to you honestly about his situation, those were his choices. You cannot live his life for him. You cannot make his decisions for him. The only thing you can do is decide how you respond to his actions. I sat back down. My heart was racing. My breathing was uneven. I was about to make a decision that would alter the course of several lives. Mine, Daniel's, potentially future generations. Do it, I said finally. I want you to modify my will. I want you to establish a foundation in Emily's honor that will receive 70% of my estate. The remaining 30% will be divided among educational institutions and organizations that work with people facing consumer addiction and chronic debt. Daniel will receive a fixed sum of $50,000 when he turns 50, on the condition that he demonstrates he has completed professional financial rehabilitation and has paid all his outstanding debts. Stephen began to write notes furiously. Are you sure about this? He asked, even as his hands were already documenting my decision. Completely, I replied. But I want the official notification to come through your office, not from me directly. I want it to be formal, legal, irrevocable. I want Daniel to understand that this isn't an impulsive reaction. This is a strategic, deliberate, carefully thought-out decision. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the new will. Every word was chosen with legal precision. Every clause was designed to be unassailable in court, resistant to any attempt by Daniel to contest it. When I finally signed the documents, the feeling was simultaneously liberating and devastating. I had cut the financial ties with my son. I had made the decision that some would call cruel, others would call prudent. Emily wasn't here to advise me. Michael could only offer his silent support. The decision was mine alone, and I owned it completely. As I left Stephen's office with the signed documents in my folder, I felt that something inside me had died. Not love. Love doesn't die that easily. It was hope. The hope that Daniel would be different, that one day he would understand what he had done, that we could rebuild our relationship. That hope was now officially dead, preserved in ink and legal paper. The court hearing was scheduled for September 16th, almost 4 months after the incident at the viewing. During that waiting period, life continued its usual rhythm, although everything around me seemed tinged with a grayish hue, as if I were seeing the world through dark glass. Emily was still absent. Her emptiness expanded into every corner of my home. Daniel was still living his life, probably unaware of the legal actions looming from multiple directions. Stephen's firm had kept me informed about the case's progress. The prosecution was preparing a solid case based on the videos from multiple witnesses, the photographs of my injuries, and the testimonies of those present at the viewing. There wasn't much Daniel and his lawyer could do to weaken the physical evidence of the attack. The morning of the trial, I woke up before dawn. I hadn't slept well. My mind had been racing for hours, replaying the events of the viewing over and over, considering different scenarios of how everything might unfold in the courtroom. I arrived at the New York County Courthouse at 8:30 a.m. Michael was waiting for me at the entrance, with 2 coffees in his hands. We sat on a wooden bench in the outer hallway, not talking much, simply keeping each other company. At 9 o'clock, a bailiff instructed us that we could enter the courtroom. The room was smaller than I had imagined. It had that characteristic smell of legal places, old paper, polished wood, and something undefinable that was uniquely its own. The judge, a man of about 65, named Judge Edwards, was reviewing documents at his elevated desk. On one side was the prosecutor, a young and energetic lawyer named Thomas Ryan. On the other side was Stephen Cole, who had agreed to represent my legal interests in court. Daniel entered 5 minutes later. He was wearing a dark suit, probably bought for the occasion. His expression was a mix of defensiveness and anxiety. His lawyer, the same one who had represented him at the precinct, took a seat beside him. Judge Edwards tapped his gavel lightly. "We are here today to proceed in the case of the people of New York versus Daniel Evans, accused of physical assault against his father, William Evans, which occurred on April 23rd at the St. Michael's Funeral Home. What happened over the next 2 hours was a meticulous presentation of evidence. The prosecutor began by showing the videos. The courtroom fell silent as they watched the sequence of events. My crying by the casket, Daniel's furious entrance, his screams, the push, my fall to the floor. The videos were played from multiple angles, provided by different eyewitnesses. Each angle offered a slightly different perspective, but they all told the same story: deliberate violence. Then the photographs of my injuries were presented. The wound on my back was magnified on a large screen, clearly showing the contact patterns that corresponded with the impact of human hands. A medical examiner was called to testify about the nature and severity of the injuries. He explained that they were consistent with a push of considerable force, done with the intent to cause harm. The witnesses were called one by one. Emily Rogers, the funeral home director, described the events with professionalism and clarity. Frank Thompson, the lawyer who was coincidentally present, provided particularly impactful testimony. He described how he had seen Daniel enter the place with clearly hostile intent, how his words had been deliberately insulting, how the push had been executed with precision, not as an accidental reaction, but as a planned act. When it was my turn to testify, Michael accompanied me to the witness chair. The judge asked me to describe the events of that day. I spoke slowly, carefully, without unnecessary drama. I described how Daniel had blamed me for Emily's death, how his words had been devastating, how the push had taken me completely by surprise. When the prosecutor asked if I had provided any physical provocation to Daniel before the attack, I answered honestly that I had not. I was standing, grieving, defenseless. The defense tried to argue that Daniel had experienced a temporary psychotic episode triggered by the stress of his mother's death. His lawyer presented statements from a psychologist who had evaluated Daniel after the incident. The psychologist argued that Daniel's behavior was consistent with a dissociative reaction to a traumatic event, but the prosecutor had anticipated that argument. He presented evidence that Daniel had been experiencing significant financial stress for months leading up to the incident. He presented excerpts from emails where Daniel expressed frustration about his economic situation. He presented testimonies from people Daniel had borrowed money from. The prosecutor argued that the true motivation behind the attack was not a psychotic reaction to Emily's death, but stress and desperation, combined with resentment toward me. When the prosecutor mentioned the audio recording of my conversation with Daniel at the City Line diner, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. The recording was played for the court. Everyone heard Daniel admitting his financial problems, mentioning the inheritance, expressing his expectation that eventually something would change in his favor. Daniel's lawyer objected vehemently, arguing the recording was inadmissible because it was made without Daniel's formal consent. But Judge Edwards consulted New York legal records and determined that in this state, one party to a conversation could record it without the other party's consent. The recording was admitted as evidence. The deliberations lasted 3 hours. When Judge Edwards finally returned to the room, he delivered his sentence. He declared Daniel guilty of physical assault, as charged. The sentence included 18 months of probation, a $3,000 fine, and a restraining order prohibiting Daniel from coming within 1,000 feet of my home, under penalty of immediate imprisonment. When the judge read the terms of the restraining order, I saw Daniel turn pale. The reality of the consequences was finally hitting his comprehension. Not only did he face a criminal record, he was being physically and legally separated from his father. But what Daniel didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning of his consequences. When Stephen approached me after the verdict and whispered that the official notification about the changes to my will would be sent to Daniel within 3 days, I understood that the real war was just beginning. Daniel had played his hand. Now it was my turn. 1 week after the court verdict, I began to execute the plan that had been forming in my mind for weeks. It wasn't a vengeful plan in the traditional sense. It was more a plan of total disconnection, a methodical separation from all points of contact that could allow Daniel to re-enter my life in any way. The first step was changing my cell phone number. For 35 years, that number had remained relatively stable, though it had evolved as technology advanced. It was a number Daniel knew by heart, a number he could dial in times of need or, as in this case, in times of manipulation. I got a new line and provided it only to trusted people: Michael, Stephen, my closest friends, some work colleagues. The second step was more complicated. I contacted all my banks and requested changes to my accounts. I created new accounts under structures that required two-factor authentication for any transaction. I reorganized my investments, transferring them to funds managed by a broker who understood my intentions. I stipulated that any future changes to my financial arrangements would require additional documentation and more rigorous identity verification. The third step was the transfer of properties. With the help of Stephen and an accountant specializing in estate matters, I transferred the deed of my main house into a trust established in Emily's honor. The property was still mine in practice, but legally, it was protected from any claim Daniel might try to make in the future. My additional properties were transferred similarly, each protected by layers of legal structure that would be practically impossible to penetrate. Then came the time for the most definitive gestures. I accessed every social media platform where I had an account and blocked Daniel: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, even old email accounts I hadn't used in years, but that Daniel might try to contact. It wasn't about erasing him from my digital life, but about creating an impenetrable wall between us. The fourth step was the final communication. I wrote a formal email, addressed through Stephen Cole, which was sent to Daniel with a copy to Daniel's lawyer. The content was carefully drafted to be both legally and psychologically conclusive. Daniel, in compliance with the restraining order issued by the court, I am formally informing you that I have implemented all necessary legal and administrative measures to ensure full compliance with that order. This includes, but is not limited to, a change of phone number, modification of all my bank accounts and investment structures, transfer of properties to trust structures, and implementation of additional security measures. Any attempt to contact me through third parties will be considered a violation of the court order and will be reported immediately to the police. I understand this is a severe consequence of your actions, but these measures are necessary to protect my personal and financial integrity. I hope you use this time to reflect on your decisions and to seek the professional help you clearly need. Your father, William Evans. 1 week after sending that email, Stephen informed me that Daniel had tried to contact me through old numbers. The calls never went anywhere. He had tried to contact me through third parties, people who knew me, common friends and colleagues. To each of them, I briefly explained that there were legal restrictions preventing any communication with me from him. But something began to happen that I hadn't fully anticipated. As the news of my total disconnection from Daniel spread through our social circle, my son's reputation began to deteriorate. The friends who had initially supported him began to question what had really happened. Some remembered the brutality of the incident at the viewing. Others had heard about his massive debts. Others simply felt uncomfortable being in the middle of such an obvious rift between father and son. 2 months after the verdict, Daniel was fired from his job. It wasn't directly because he had a criminal record, although that didn't help. It was because his employer, a financial services company, didn't want the negative association he represented. An employee with an assault conviction and visible financial problems was simply not a viable option for an institution that handled clients' money without a job. Daniel's situation became even more desperate. His creditors intensified their collection efforts. The private lenders began to press more aggressively. Daniel tried to get additional credit to cover his existing debts, but without a stable income, that was practically impossible. It was during this period that I began to notice that my own life, though devastated by Emily's death and Daniel's betrayal, was beginning to take a new shape. Without the constant anxiety about Daniel, without the need to hold out hope for a possible reconciliation, without the weight of resentment I hadn't fully recognized I was carrying, I began to feel a certain relief. Michael noticed the change. "You look different, William," he commented during one of our morning walks in the park. "Not happy." "Exactly, but maybe more at peace." "It's strange," I replied, watching the ducks swim in the pond. I expected that cutting him off completely would be devastating. I thought I would regret it, but instead, I feel like I've dropped a weight I didn't know I was carrying. "Daniel made his own choices," Michael said. "You're just allowing yourself to live with the consequences of his decisions, instead of carrying the burden of trying to save him." As the fall of 2019 progressed, Daniel's life continued its decline. He had lost his job. His friends avoided him. His creditors hounded him. The restraining order prohibited him from being near his father, which meant he couldn't even access potential business contacts or friends who might be in my social circle. What was beginning to unfold was a kind of non-violent, poetic justice. Daniel wasn't being punished by me directly. He was being punished by the natural consequences of his own actions, amplified by my strategic disconnection. And the most interesting part was, I didn't even need to be present to see it. Justice was carrying itself out automatically, like a clockwork mechanism that had been set in motion and now simply followed its inevitable course. 6 months had passed since I implemented the total isolation measures. It was January 2020, and New York was experiencing one of its coldest winters in years. The nights were long and dark, the kind of weather that makes a person feel more alone, even when surrounded by people. But I wasn't surrounded by people. I spent most of my days in relative solitude, except for occasional meetings with Michael. What was happening with Daniel during those months was something I only knew through third parties. I didn't track him. I didn't hire investigators. I didn't cultivate sources of information. But in a city like New York, especially in circles where both Daniel and I had connections, stories circulated naturally, like coins passed from hand to hand. The first news came through Frank Thompson, the lawyer who had testified in my favor during the trial. We ran into each other at a coffee shop, and he mentioned he had seen Daniel on the street looking unwell. "He looks like he's lost weight," Frank commented, "and he's wearing clothes that look several years old." Shortly after, John Reynolds, the man who had loaned Daniel $15,000, contacted Michael by phone. He informed him that Daniel had tried to contact him again, this time with a desperate proposition. He wanted to sell a property he owned, an apartment on the outskirts of the city, to raise money to help pay his debts. John had declined to get involved. What was developing was a pattern of social isolation that went beyond just being rejected by his father. Daniel was being rejected by society itself. A colleague of mine from years past, someone I had worked with almost 15 years ago, mentioned to me during a social gathering that he had heard Daniel was trying to find work, but his applications were constantly rejected. The reasons were multiple: a criminal record, lack of reliable work references, the nature of the crime that had convicted him. A conviction for assaulting a parent at a funeral is exactly the kind of incident that doesn't fade from the memory of potential employers. But the most disturbing part was when Emily Rogers, the director of the funeral home where it all began, contacted me through Stephen. She had seen Daniel trying to talk to some of the funeral home employees, possibly looking for a job or just looking for someone to listen. The employees, knowing who he was and what he had done, had firmly rejected him. What struck me during all of this was not satisfaction, as I might have expected. It was a kind of contemplative indifference. Daniel was suffering the consequences of his actions, but that suffering didn't bring me joy. It simply confirmed that actions have repercussions, that mistakes have costs, that life is not a game where you can move forward and backward without permanent consequences. In February, Michael shared information he had gotten from a friend of his who worked in social services. Daniel had applied for emergency financial assistance from the government. His situation had reached a point where he couldn't pay the rent on his apartment. He was considering asking the court to discharge some of his debt obligations, a process that usually only works if there are genuinely extreme circumstances. "Do you think you should intervene?" Michael asked during one of our walks. "You could help him, William, just a small amount." "Enough so he doesn't end up on the street," I answered honestly. "No, Michael. If I intervene now, I would be undoing everything we've built. I would be allowing Daniel to avoid the full consequences of his decisions, and that would only set him up to make the same mistakes again." "Even if he ends up homeless?" Michael pressed. "Even then," I replied, "because what hurts Daniel isn't just the absence of money. It's the absence of boundaries. It's the absence of real consequences. For his entire life, there was always someone, his mother, me, who rescued him when things got tough. Now that we're not there to rescue him, he's finally learning that his actions have a price." What happened over the following months was a gradual but relentless deterioration of Daniel's life. He was forced to sell his apartment. He moved into a rented room in a less desirable area of the city. His employment prospects remained limited. Creditors haunted him. Credit institutions had classified him as an extreme risk, but the most significant thing was what happened in his social circle. The friendships that had initially supported him disappeared. People who had seen him as a young man with potential began to see him as a warning, an example of what happens when someone makes too many wrong decisions. He was invited to fewer social events. His former co-workers avoided contact. Even his own relatives began to create distance. In April, exactly 1 year after the incident at the viewing, I received a letter. It came from a different legal firm, not from Daniel's lawyer. It was sent via Stephen. The letter stated that Daniel was requesting the restraining order be lifted, arguing that he had completed therapy, that he was repentant, and that he would like the opportunity to heal his family relationship. I showed the letter to Michael without saying anything at first. "What will you do?" he asked. "The same thing I've been doing for the last 18 months, I replied. "Nothing. I will simply continue living my life." Stephen filed a motion with the court, requesting the restraining order be maintained, citing Daniel's continued history of indirect contact attempts through third parties. Judge Edwards, the same judge who had presided over the original trial, approved the motion without needing another hearing. The restraining order would remain in place. The door was still closed. What was ironic was that the door I had deliberately closed was now less important than the door Daniel had closed for himself through his own actions. I could reverse my disconnection at any time if I truly wanted to. I could allow Daniel back into my life. But even if I did, even if I lifted all my administrative and legal barriers, the real barrier would remain. The barrier that exists when trust has been completely destroyed, when mutual understanding has vanished, when a relationship has been so completely eroded that rebuilding it would require so much effort that both parties would have to decide if it was worth it. And Daniel simply wasn't worth it. 1 year after the court verdict, life had taken on a completely different texture. It wasn't happiness in the traditional sense. Emily was still gone. She would continue to be for the rest of my days. But the pain had changed its character. It was no longer that sharp burn that makes breathing difficult. It had become something softer, more integrated, like a scar one learns to carry. The most notable change was in my relationship with time. During the first few months after Emily's death and the conflict with Daniel, time had been my enemy. The days dragged on. The nights were endless. Each hour seemed to hold the weight of several. But as I moved into 2020, time began to flow differently. I started to travel. It was something Emily and I had planned to do during our retirement, but never got to fully execute. Now, without the ties of trying to maintain a relationship with Daniel, without the responsibility of being available for family crises that never materialized, I just left. I spent 3 weeks in Italy. I visited Rome, Florence, Venice. I walked on cobblestone streets that had existed for centuries. I entered churches that contained art Emily had longed to see. In each cathedral, I lit a candle for her. It wasn't a particularly profound religious act, but simply a way of bringing her with me as I experienced the things we couldn't experience together. Michael came with me for part of the trip. It was during a dinner at a small trattoria in Trastevere that Michael said something that changed my perspective. "William, I've been thinking about how you've handled all this, and I've come to a conclusion." "What's that?" I asked, savoring a pasta carbonara that was probably better than anything I had eaten back home. "You won," Michael replied simply. "Not because Daniel is suffering. You won because you got your life back. Because you're no longer living reactively, responding to his actions. You're living actively, doing the things you want to do." I thought about that for several days. Had I really won? Or had I just escaped? When I returned to New York in June 2020, I made an important decision. I contacted a local organization that worked with people facing drug addiction and chronic debt problems. I offered myself as a volunteer, not as a way to redeem myself or seek forgiveness, simply as a way to channel my experience into something productive. What I discovered was that working with people who were facing the same circumstances Daniel faced gave me a new perspective. These men and women, because there were both, were often people who had made poor choices, accumulated debt, destroyed relationships. But what many of them shared was a fundamental lack of responsibility. They blamed the system. They blamed their families. They blamed society. They rarely blamed themselves. It reminded me of Daniel, but it also showed me that there were exceptions. There were people who came to the programs, accepted full responsibility for their actions, and made genuine changes. These people were rare, but they existed. Could Daniel be one of them? Honestly, I didn't know, and more importantly, I no longer cared. During that period, the Emily Evans Foundation for Education was formally established. It would provide scholarships to students from low-income families. Every year, hundreds of young people would have educational opportunities they otherwise wouldn't have. Emily's name would be remembered, not for her death, but for the lives she had inspired me to support. I spent hours working with accountants and foundation administrators, ensuring it was structured correctly, that the funds were distributed equitably, that Emily's legacy was protected and expanded. In October 2020, I first visited the spot where Emily and I had planned to build a small country house years ago, a piece of land we never developed because there was always time later. The property was still available. I bought the land and hired an architect to design a house to specific specifications, a place where I could spend the last years of my life, a quiet place, away from the complications of the city. The construction would take 18 months. During that time, I continued my travels, my volunteering, my deep friendships with Michael and others I had met through my new activities. What was happening with Daniel during this period was something I had practically stopped monitoring. Michael occasionally shared information that reached his ears, that Daniel was working a menial job, that his financial circumstances were slowly improving, although they remained difficult, that he seemed to have given up attempts to contact me. But that information no longer affected my emotional state significantly. Daniel had ceased to be the center of my narrative. He had ceased to be the person around whom I structured my decisions. On a spring afternoon in 2021, while walking through Central Park with Michael, I made an observation that surprised us both. "I don't hate Daniel," I said, unprompted. "And I don't love him. He just exists, like a person I once knew, but who no longer exists in my life." "Is that peace?" Michael asked. "I think so," I replied. "It's indifference, but benevolent indifference. I hope Daniel finds a way to live with his circumstances. I hope he eventually understands what went wrong. But I no longer depend on that for my own serenity. What I had acquired over the last 18 months was something I had lost when Emily died. Autonomy, control over my own life, the ability to define my future on my own terms, not in reaction to what Daniel did or didn't do. And that, I discovered, was more valuable than any cinematic revenge I could have imagined. 18 months after the verdict, on an October evening in 2021, something happened that I hadn't planned, and that life simply decided should occur. I was walking down Madison Avenue, returning from a meeting with my administrators about the Emily Foundation's projects. The weather was mild. The golden light of sunset illuminated the historic buildings with a softness that made everything seem cinematic. I was lost in thought, considering how to expand the scholarship programs to other states. That's when I saw him. Daniel was standing outside a second-hand clothing store, looking at the window display. His appearance was the first thing that caught my attention. He had aged significantly. His hair, which I remembered as dark brown and thick, was now gray and receding at the temples. His face looked worn down, as if he had been through a prolonged illness. The clothes he wore were outdated and worn, exactly the kind of garments you might find inside that thrift store. My first instinct was to change direction, to avoid the encounter completely. I could have crossed the street. I could have entered a store. I could have simply turned around. But something in me, curiosity, perhaps, or just the inertia of following the same path, made me continue forward. When I reached Daniel's level, he looked up. In that instant, his expression changed from empty contemplation to complete surprise. His eyes widened. I saw his mouth begin to form words. "Father," I said nothing. I just kept walking. It was such a small action, so insignificant in the scheme of things. I just kept moving down the street as if Daniel didn't exist, as if he were an obstacle my body automatically avoided. But in that silent act, the entire history of the last 18 months was contained. The complete disconnection was contained. The irreversible decision was contained. The closing of a door that would never be opened again was contained. I heard Daniel move behind me. For a moment, I had the impression he might follow me, that he might try to talk, that he might plead for a chance at reconciliation, but he didn't. He just stood there on the sidewalk, watching me walk away. I didn't turn to look at him again. I continued walking to my car, which was parked 2 blocks away. I got in, started the engine, and drove through the streets of New York toward my home. During the entire drive, I didn't think about Daniel, or at least, not in the way I would have thought about him years ago. There was no satisfaction in my chest, no feeling of victory. There was nothing in particular. It just continued to be the absence of something. When I got home, I called Michael. I needed to share the encounter with someone, even if only to process it. "I saw him today," I said when he answered. "It was by chance. He was on the street, looking at a store. I just walked past." Michael was silent for a moment. "How do you feel?" he finally asked. "I don't know exactly," I answered honestly. "Empty, maybe, but not a sad emptiness. It's more like I finally understood that the chapter I was supposed to close 18 months ago finally closed today. There was nothing to say. There was nothing to do. It was just time to move on." "Do you think Daniel will try to contact you again?" Michael asked. "I don't know. And, frankly, it doesn't matter. The restraining order is still in effect. My phone numbers are still the same as they were 18 months ago. I've taken all the necessary precautions. If Daniel tries to contact me, the legal structures we've established will activate automatically, but I don't think he will. I think he finally understood today, on that street, that there is nothing of me to recover. What happened in the following months was a natural continuation of the life I had been building. The country house was completed in December 2021. It was exactly as Emily and I had imagined it, a modern structure yet harmonious with its rural surroundings, with large windows that allowed natural light to flood the interior spaces, with a garden that promised to be beautiful the following spring. I spent my 64th birthday in that house, accompanied by Michael and a small group of friends I had cultivated over the previous years. They weren't the biological family you might expect at a birthday celebration for a man my age, but they were something more valuable. They were people who had chosen to be present, who weren't obligated to be there by blood or family responsibility, but simply because they wanted to be. I continued the travels. I continued volunteering. I continued expanding the Emily Foundation. I continued living a life that was completely mine, not defined by the traumas of the past, not built around people who had proven to be unworthy of my emotional investment. Years later, as I reflected on everything that had happened, I understood that the most important lesson wasn't about Daniel at all. It was about myself. It was about the ability we all possess to set boundaries, to protect our emotional and financial well-being, to recognize when a relationship has become toxic, beyond repair. My father had once taught me that life isn't fair. Daniel would learn that lesson much harder than he probably deserved. But more importantly, I had learned that justice wasn't something I should wait for the universe to provide. Justice was something I created for myself, through deliberate actions, through decisions made with purpose, through the refusal to let the mistakes of others define the course of my life. The door I had closed on Daniel remained closed, not because I was cruel. It remained closed because it was necessary. It remained closed because some bonds, once broken so fundamentally, simply cannot be repaired with enough care to make the effort worthwhile. And in the stillness of my rebuilt life, in the travels I took, in the people I chose to have around me, in the legacy I was creating in honor of Emily, I finally found the peace I had been searching for. It wasn't the peace of forgetting, it was the peace of acceptance. The peace of knowing I had done everything I could, that I had protected what was important, and that now I could finally live without carrying the weight of someone else's decisions. That, I discovered, was enough. If you like this story, support us with a like, subscribe to William's Revenge Stories, and leave your opinions in the comments. To hear the next story, click the box that appears on the left. Thanks for joining us.